Sarah was 12 years old when she learned that asking for dignity was a crime punishable by the whip. It was August 14th, 1836, on Belmont Plantation in St. James Parish, Louisiana, and the piece of cloth she wore as a dress had become so torn, so threadbare, that it barely covered her body anymore. She had worn it for over a year, through the brutal heat of 2 Louisiana summers, through rain and work and growth. The fabric hung in strips from her thin shoulders, and when the wind blew, she had to hold the pieces together with her hands to maintain even a shred of modesty. So she did what any desperate child would do. She asked for help, and Mistress Catherine Belmont made sure Sarah would never ask for anything again. Belmont Plantation stretched across 800 acres of rich Louisiana soil, producing sugarcane that made the Belmont family one of the wealthiest in St. James Parish. Master Edmund Belmont owned 147 enslaved people in 1836, ranging from infants to elderly field workers. Sarah was one of 32 children under the age of 15, born into bondage, knowing nothing but the plantation's cruel rhythms. Sarah had been born in the slave quarters in 1824, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who worked in the cane fields. Ruth had died of fever when Sarah was 7, leaving the child essentially orphaned in a system that saw children as future labor, nothing more. At 12, Sarah was considered old enough to work, but not valuable enough to receive proper clothing or care. She worked in the big house, doing simple tasks, carrying water, sweeping floors, running errands for the white family. She was fed minimal rations, slept on the floor of a cabin she shared with 8 other people, and wore the single piece of cloth that had been given to her when she turned 11. That cloth had once been a simple shift dress, made from the cheapest cotton fabric, barely adequate even when new. But a year of constant wear, of washing in harsh lye soap, of working in heat and humidity, had destroyed it. By August of 1836, it was falling apart. The hem had completely unraveled. The seams had split open on both sides. The neckline was torn so badly that Sarah had to pin it closed with a thorn every morning, and still she received no replacement. The other enslaved children were in similar condition. Some wore flour sacks with holes cut for arms and head. Others wore scraps tied together with string. The younger children, under age 6 or 7, often wore nothing at all. This was common on plantations throughout the South, a deliberate strategy to minimize costs and to dehumanize the enslaved population from childhood. If you could make children grow up without basic dignity, without adequate clothing, without the small kindnesses that acknowledge humanity, you could break their spirits before they were old enough to resist. But Sarah, at 12, still had hope. She still believed that if she asked politely, if she explained her need clearly, someone might help her. She didn't understand yet that the system was designed to crush exactly that kind of hope. On the morning of August 14th, 1836, Sarah was sweeping the front porch of the main house when her dress finally gave up entirely. The already weakened fabric ripped from shoulder to waist, leaving her partially exposed. She tried to hold it together, but there was simply not enough fabric left to cover her adequately. Tears filled her eyes, not just from embarrassment, but from the desperate realization that she couldn't continue like this. Mistress Catherine Belmont emerged onto the porch at that moment, dressed in layers of fine muslin and lace despite the August heat. Catherine was 38 years old, the mother of 4 children and the manager of all domestic affairs at Belmont Plantation. She was known for her meticulous management, her attention to detail, and her complete lack of compassion for the enslaved people under her control. "Why have you stopped working?" Catherine asked, her voice sharp. Sarah clutched the torn fabric to her chest. "Mistress, my dress, it's torn real bad. I can't keep it together no more." Catherine looked at Sarah with cold eyes. "Then hold it and continue sweeping." "But mistress, it won't stay. It's too torn. I was hoping." Sarah's voice trembled. "Could I maybe have a new piece of cloth? Just something to cover myself proper. This one is falling to pieces." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but to Sarah, it felt like an eternity. Catherine's face remained expressionless, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "You're asking me for something." Catherine's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Yes, ma'am, just a piece of cloth. It don't have to be nothing fancy. Just something so I can be covered while I work." "You think you have the right to ask me for things?" Sarah's heart began to pound. Something in the mistress's tone warned her that she had made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry, ma'am. I just thought maybe..." "You thought wrong." Catherine turned toward the door and called out, "Edmund, come here, please." Master Edmund Belmont appeared a moment later, a heavy-set man of 45 with a beard and tired eyes. He had been reviewing accounts in his study. "What is it, Catherine?" "This girl just demanded that I give her new clothing." "I didn't demand, sir. I just asked..." "Be silent!" Catherine's voice cracked like a whip. She interrupted her work to complain about her dress and to demand that I provide her with better clothing. "This is insolence, Edmund. This is exactly the kind of behavior that leads to disobedience and rebellion." Edmund looked at Sarah, at her torn dress, at her frightened face. For a moment, something that might have been pity crossed his features, but it passed quickly. Edmund Belmont was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a weak one, and he had learned long ago that disagreeing with his wife caused more problems than it solved. "What do you want me to do?" he asked Catherine. "I want her punished. 15 lashes, and I want every other child on this plantation to watch. They need to understand that asking for things, demanding things above their station, will not be tolerated." Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Please, mistress, I'm sorry. I didn't mean no disrespect. I just..." "Take her to the yard," Catherine said to Edmund. "I'll gather the children." What happened next became one of the most traumatic memories for every child who witnessed it. Within 20 minutes, all 32 enslaved children at Belmont Plantation were assembled in the yard between the big house and the slave quarters. They ranged in age from 5 to 15, their faces reflecting confusion, fear, and growing understanding of what they were about to witness. Sarah was brought to the center of the yard. Her hands were tied to a post. Her already torn dress was pulled down to expose her back. She was crying, begging, promising she would never ask for anything again. The other children watched in horrified silence, some of the younger ones clinging to older siblings. Catherine stood before the assembled children and spoke clearly. "You are all here to learn an important lesson. This girl," she gestured to Sarah, "asked me for new clothing this morning. She complained about what she has. She demanded that I give her something better. This is unacceptable behavior. You have what we choose to give you. You eat what we choose to feed you. You wear what we choose to provide, and you never ever ask for more. Is that understood?" No one answered. The silence was heavy with fear and rage that had nowhere to go. "Is that understood?" Catherine repeated, her voice harder. A few small voices mumbled, "Yes, ma'am." Edmund administered the punishment himself, using a leather strap that was kept for such purposes. Each lash across Sarah's bare back drew a scream. By the 5th lash, several of the younger children were crying. By the 10th, Sarah's voice had become hoarse. At 15, Edmund stopped, and Sarah hung limply from the post, her back crisscrossed with welts, some bleeding. "Cut her down," Catherine said. "Put her in the storage shed for 3 days. No food, only water, and she can think about whether asking for things was worth this consequence." Sarah was dragged to a small wooden shed used for storing tools and locked inside. The other children were dismissed back to their work, traumatized by what they had witnessed, carrying the message Catherine had intended. Don't ask for anything. Don't expect kindness. Don't believe your suffering matters. What Catherine Belmont didn't know was that her calculated cruelty had been witnessed by someone whose opinion actually mattered. Edmund's brother, William Belmont, had arrived at the plantation that morning for a visit. William lived in New Orleans, where he worked as a lawyer and merchant. He was 42 years old, unmarried, and had always been uncomfortable with the family's involvement in slavery, though he lacked the courage to oppose it openly. He had been standing at a window inside the house when the entire scene unfolded in the yard. William had watched Catherine gather the children. He had watched Sarah tied to the post. He had watched his brother whip a 12-year-old girl for the crime of asking for clothing to cover her body. And something inside William Belmont broke. After Sarah was locked in the shed and the yard cleared, William went to find Edmund in his study. "What in God's name just happened out there?" William demanded. Edmund looked up, surprised by his brother's tone. Catherine felt the girl needed to be disciplined. She was being insolent. Insolent? "Edmund, she's a child who asked for a piece of cloth because her dress is falling apart. I saw her. She's practically naked. And your response was to have her whipped in front of every child on this plantation. Catherine handles the domestic slaves. I don't interfere with her management." Her management. William's voice rose. "That wasn't management, that was cruelty. That was terrorizing children to maintain control through fear." "Keep your voice down," Edmund said nervously. "Catherine will hear you." "I don't care if she hears me. Edmund, that girl is 12 years old. 12. The same age as your own daughter Mary. Would you whip Mary for asking for a new dress when her old one was torn? That's different. Mary is what? Is white as your daughter? Of course she is. But that doesn't change the fact that the child you just had whipped is still a child, still a human being, still someone who experiences pain and fear and humiliation, just like Mary would." Edmund was silent, his face troubled. He knew William was right. He had felt it himself when he administered those lashes, felt the wrongness of it, the excessive cruelty. But he also knew that admitting it would mean confronting Catherine, would mean acknowledging that the system they both profited from was built on monstrous acts, would mean taking responsibility for choices he preferred to avoid thinking about. "What do you want me to do?" Edmund asked finally, his voice defeated. "Release that child from the shed. Get her proper medical care for her back, give her adequate clothing, and tell your wife that if I ever witness something like this again, I will use every legal and social connection I have to make sure everyone in St. James Parish knows exactly what kind of household you're running here." It was an empty threat. Really? William had no legal standing to interfere with how Edmund managed his own property, but Edmund was weak enough and guilty enough that the threat worked. That afternoon, Sarah was released from the shed after only 3 hours instead of 3 days. An older enslaved woman named Hannah, who had some medical knowledge, was allowed to treat Sarah's wounds with herbs and clean cloth. And the next day, Sarah received a new shift dress, made from sturdy cotton fabric, properly hemmed and fitted. The other children received new clothing as well over the following weeks, though nothing was ever said about why the sudden change in policy occurred. Catherine fumed privately about William's interference, but couldn't openly defy her husband when he, for once, stood firm on something. Sarah healed physically over the next month, though the scars on her back remained for the rest of her life. But the psychological wound went deeper. She never asked for anything again. None of the children did. William's intervention had prevented one particular cruelty from being extended, but it didn't change the fundamental system. Sarah remained enslaved at Belmont Plantation for another 27 years. The Civil War reached Louisiana in 1863, and when Union forces occupied St. James Parish, Sarah was 39 years old. She walked away from Belmont Plantation in May of 1863 and never returned. She settled in New Orleans, worked as a laundress, and lived until 1889. In her later years, she would sometimes speak about August of 1836. about the day she asked for cloth to cover herself and was whipped for that simple request. The memory never faded. The lesson it taught never left her. "I learned that day that asking for dignity was a crime," she would say. "I learned that my needs didn't matter, that my body didn't belong to me, that even covering myself was a privilege they could take away. I was 12 years old, and I learned that I was nothing." But Sarah also remembered William Belmont, the man who had intervened when he didn't have to, who had used his influence to stop one act of cruelty, even though he couldn't dismantle the entire system. He wasn't a hero, Sarah would say. He didn't free nobody. He didn't end slavery. But that day he saw a wrong and he tried to make it right, even just a little bit. Sometimes that's all you get. A little bit of mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Edmund Belmont died in 1858, never having freed a single enslaved person in his lifetime. Catherine lived until 1872, bitter about the war that had destroyed her way of life. William Belmont died in 1869, having never married, having never profited from slavery after that day in 1836, having spent the rest of his life quietly ashamed of his family's legacy. The story of Sarah's punishment became known in St. James Parish, whispered about in the quarters, passed down through generations. It became a testament to the absolute dehumanization of enslaved children, to the way even the most basic human needs could be used as weapons of control, to the cruelty of a system that saw a 12-year-old asking for clothing as a threat requiring violent suppression. But it also became a story about a moment when one person said, "Enough," when moral conscience briefly overcame social convention, when even within an evil system, someone chose to resist one act of cruelty. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't justice. But for Sarah, on that August day in 1836, it was the difference between 3 days locked in darkness and being released after 3 hours. Sometimes, in the darkest times, that's all you can hope for. Sarah lived long enough to see slavery end. She lived long enough to wear whatever clothing she chose, to buy fabric with her own money, to never again have to ask permission to cover her own body. But she never forgot the girl she had been at 12, standing on a porch in a torn dress, gathering the courage to ask for something so basic that no human being should have to ask for it at all. And she never forgot the lesson that August Day taught her and 31 other children. That in a system built on dehumanization, even asking for dignity was an act of rebellion, punishable by violence. The scars on her back healed, but the scar on her soul, the knowledge of what it meant to be seen as less than human, that never fully healed at all.